All right, thank you. Thank you, Terry. Terry must be suffering from sometimers. Sometimes he remembers and sometimes he doesn't. All right, good evening. It's good to see everybody, and glad to have you with us here this evening in the Memorial Building and those that have joined us online. Let me mention a couple of things real quick before we get into our study. The Harris Life Group that meets on Sunday evenings on September 8th, 15th, and the 22nd, they are going to be having Brother John Basham, a retired missionary here in the Hixson First, is going to be teaching on those 3 evenings on Islam. And John has done that quite a bit around the area and so forth, and certainly knows his stuff and what he's talking about. And so if you'd like to be a part of that, touch base with Don or Patty, and we've already got the Memorial Building reserved for you all, just in case it happens that you need it. So keep that in mind. That group meets at 6 o'clock on Sunday evenings. And if you're not part of a life group and you'd rather have one that meets in the evenings, that's a good one to be involved with. In fact, it's the only one we got on the evening time. But it's a very good life group. So I'd encourage you to be a part of that. Also, let me mention this, kind of a follow-up on the sale of the mission house I was talking about, or we talked about Sunday. One of the things we've got to do is get it cleaned out, furniture and everything. So I've got it set up on the 31st of August. We've got a truck coming to pick up all the stuff. This coming Monday, which will be the 26th, 9 o'clock. Anybody that's available and can come help us move some of those items, basically got furniture and things of that nature, some beds, dressers, chest of drawers, various things like that and so forth. We need some help moving things into the garage, staging it so they can pick it up. And then also some folks that come along and just kind of go behind and help clean a little bit. So we'd appreciate that very much if you can help us with that. So we'll be sending that out also by email and mentioning it again Sunday. And if you have any questions afterwards, just come by and see me. All right, so if you take your Bibles and open them with us to the book of Revelation, we're going to go back to the text we were in this past Sunday morning. And so here's what we're going to do. I kind of changed plans a little bit here this evening because I happened to think about the text and the nature of what we were dealing with as we were talking about and finished up the message about the dragon and the 2 beasts. And so, of course, this past Sunday morning, we were dealing with the second beast, and then, of course, what flows from that. And we're going to read that text in just a minute. But here's what I happen to think about that we needed to talk about here this evening. That is what you've probably heard of, and you might have studied it before. You may not know a whole lot about it, but it's the Abomination of Desolation. And we're going to talk about that because it's not directly mentioned in the book of Revelation, not in those terms. But you do see it, but it's not labeled in that way. And so what I want to do is pull together a number of different texts and so forth and help us to have a good understanding of what the Abomination of Desolation is, what is the history behind it, the scriptures related to it, and then that way when you see it in Revelation, you know what it is, okay? So we're going to be talking about that, and in Revelation 13, 11 through 18. So remember, this deals with the second beast, false prophet, and then, of course, you have out of that his promoting the worship of the first beast, the Antichrist. Then there's the image of the beast, which he orders to be created and supposedly breathes life, and it comes to life and so forth. And then there was the mark of the beast. So let's begin with verse number 11 of Revelation chapter 13. So it says, "Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. And he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, or in his behalf, in his name, and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. He performs great signs, so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men, and he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here's wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666. Now, as I mentioned, this is the perfect place for us to talk about this subject of the abomination of desolation. Some of us may have heard of it before, don't really quite understand what it is or how it relates to Revelation and what we read. And so, as I said earlier, that the abomination of desolation is not mentioned by name in the book of Revelation, okay? Following the introduction of the image of the beast in Revelation 13, 15, which we just read, and of course the false prophet and everything that goes on there, it begins talking about in this text the worship of the beast and the worship of the image of the beast and so forth. And so here's what you find as we go forward in Revelation. As we go forward, what we're going to start finding repeated on a number of instances is this: the worship of the beast and the image of the beast. The worship of the image of the beast, the Antichrist, and worship of the image of the beast. You're going to find those two together in several instances as we go forward, okay? Now, those are directly linked to this whole concept of the abomination of desolation. Really what that's describing, when you read in Revelation going forward, where it talks about the worship of the beast and of the image of the beast, it's talking about worshiping them both. That is, in essence, talking about the abomination of desolation. It's just not using that title there, okay? It's not using that phrase, that terminology, okay? Now, Jesus spoke about the abomination of desolation. He spoke about it specifically, and so did Daniel the prophet. And so if you'll find in your Bibles, and if you look at the outline, you'll see the text that we're going to be referring to. So if you'll go ahead and find Matthew chapter 24, because we're going to be looking at them in the order that you have there in your outline. So in Matthew chapter 24, what we call the little apocalypse, Jesus tells us that this idea, this thing called the abomination of desolation, is a critical sign. It is a critical warning that the Great Tribulation has begun. So here's what we're doing. Remember, after we got towards the end of the tribulation there with the end of the trumpets and so forth, we basically said we're technically at the end of the tribulation. And these chapters that we've been going over since that time, remember, they're laying down layers. In other words, what I mean by layers is they're telling us additional information about additional things that are happening between the beginning of the Great Tribulation and leading to the end of the tribulation. Well, this is another piece of that, all right? And so one of the things that Jesus tells us, as we'll see here in just a moment, that for those who are living during the time of the tribulation, that when they see the abomination of desolation, you can know that it's on. That's where the trouble really begins. Okay? So in Matthew chapter 24, and we're going to read verses 15 through 22 in just a moment. The context of the verses just prior to that is where Jesus is talking about that there are going to be wars and rumors of wars. There are going to be false prophets. There are going to be false Christ, okay? Really what Jesus is telling us in those verses there is this. That's pretty much the pattern of the whole Christian age. Ever since the time of Jesus up until now, there's always been wars and rumors of wars. There's always been false prophets. There's always been false Christ, okay? But Jesus goes on and he concludes that. He concludes that section by saying this. Look at verse 14 if you're looking at Matthew 24. So he concludes that section right there with this right here. And he says, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come." So all through the age, all through the church age, the age of grace, there's always these wars and rumors of wars. There are always these false prophets and these false Christs and so forth. That's going to go on for the duration of the church age, okay? Until, from God's perspective, that the gospel has been preached to all nations. Now, God's going to know that better and before any of us know that, right? But when from God's perspective, he says, now the gospel has been preached to all the nations, then the end will come. All right? Now, so how does that end begin? What's going to be the first thing that will happen when the gospel has been preached to all the nations from the Father's perspective? What's going to be the first thing that's going to happen? The rapture. The church is going to be snatched away, called away to heaven. All right? Then what's going to follow? Now this is my perspective on it. I believe that in that interim time, that there's going to be an interim time between the rapture and the beginning of the tribulation, when the white horse rides out, which is the Antichrist. He starts riding out on the world stage. That's when I believe Gog and Magog, Ezekiel 37:38, that war is going to take place. All right? Then the tribulation begins with the rider on the white horse, Antichrist coming onto the scene and so forth, and 3.5 years of peace. And then you have the red horse. And from my perspective, that correlates with Jesus' teaching about when the tribulation begins, okay? But the point is that when the gospel has been preached, then comes the end, all right? And so after there's the rapture, then the tribulation begins. We got the first 3.5 years of the tribulation. Then we get to the part of the tribulation that Jesus primarily was focused on. The words that Jesus spoke about the tribulation primarily deals with the Great Tribulation, which is what period of time? The last 3.5 years. All right, that's the primary focus of Jesus in his teaching. All right. Now, so if you look in Matthew chapter 24, beginning at verse number 15, Jesus says this: "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place." Now this is Jesus, he makes a statement right here. Whoever reads, let him understand what I'm saying. And the point being is this: for those living in that era and this occurs, don't miss it. This is a critical sign to let you know that the period called the Great Tribulation has begun. All right? So what's the sign? What does Jesus say the sign is? What is it? The abomination of desolation. Okay? When that happens, and you see it and you're aware of it, you can know the Great Tribulation has begun. All right? Verse 16, "Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes." In other words, Jesus is saying, when you see this, you need to get out of Dodge. You need to run. Okay? Verse number 20. Verse 19, "But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days, and pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath." Verse 21, "For then there will be" what? Great tribulation. Meaning that this event, the abomination of desolation, is the thing that kicks off the Great Tribulation. "There will be great tribulation." Now listen to this. such as has not been since the beginning of the world or until this time, nor ever shall be. Now, those words right there, has not been since the beginning of time of the world, until this time, nor ever shall be, is describing the great tribulation. So in your words, how would you translate Jesus' words describing the great tribulation? How bad is it going to be? What? It's going to be the worst it's ever been. There have never been days on the earth like this, and there never will be, because by the time this thing's all over, all this stuff's going to be done away with. After the kingdom, Jesus is going to reign on the kingdom, but eventually it's going to be done away with, and there's a new heaven and new earth, all right? Verse 22. And unless those days were shortened, that is, the days of the tribulation, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Now, here's what I want you to notice here. Jesus refers to Daniel the prophet. Notice he says, when you see the abomination of desolation, verse 15, spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Now Daniel lived and ministered in the 6th century BC, so roughly some 600 years before Jesus, all right? But even in Daniel's day, Daniel spoke of this event called the abomination of desolation. Now, so if you'll notice in your outline, the next text is Daniel chapter 7, which we were in that last week. I want you to go back there. Go back to Daniel chapter 7. And you'll also want to keep your Bible open to Daniel, because we'll be looking at chapter 9 also. So let's go back and let's look and see what Daniel has to say about the abomination of desolation. Now, the context here in Daniel chapter 7, and what we're going to read, is where Daniel had the vision of the 4 beasts. Remember? He saw a beast that looked like a lion, one like a leopard, one like a bear, and then he says, and I saw a terrible beast that had 10 horns. All right? That last beast, the terrible beast that Daniel saw that has 10 horns, spoke of the Roman Empire that would disintegrate, but eventually it would be resurrected again as what we have referred to as a confederation of European states, or the United States of Europe, okay? Under the rule of Antichrist. And so when Daniel, in these verses, he is speaking about the Antichrist, okay? Now look in chapter 7, verse 25. He says this: he shall speak pompous words against the Most High. This is the Antichrist he's speaking about. He shall persecute the saints of the Most High. And then what's the next phrase? What does it say?
Change times and law.
And he will intend to change times and law. And then the saints will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time, which is 3.5 years, right? Now, I shared with you last week that the phrase that says, shall intend to change times and laws, remember I shared with you last week what that refers to, what happens during the tribulation where Antichrist changes times and law. He breaks the covenant, right? He makes peace, and Israel's given this covenant, says, look, I'm going to guarantee your security from here on out, okay? But basically, in the middle of it, this 7-year agreement, he breaks it and he changes times and law. We'll elaborate on that a little bit more. But that's at the midpoint of the tribulation. So here's what he does. He breaks the covenant that basically guaranteed Jews safety. It guarantees them the freedom to worship God in the tribulation temple, offering sacrifices, just like in the Old Testament and so forth. And they're worshiping God. That comes to an end. But there's more that's going to take place at this time. So I want you to look over to Daniel chapter number 9, because Daniel talks about this again in Daniel chapter number 9. In verse number 27. So in Daniel chapter 9, in verse 27, we read this. Then he, referring to Antichrist, the prince that is to come, the little horn, all of those refer to the Antichrist. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, which we just spoke about, okay? And that 1 week is equal to what? 7 years. Remember, Daniel's 70 weeks of years. Each week is equivalent to 7 years, okay? But in the middle of the week, 3.5 years, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. Okay, so we basically saw that just a minute ago in chapter 7, didn't we? But now listen to this. This is where Daniel adds to it. And on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate. There Daniel's talking about this abomination of desolation. Even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. Okay, so basically, this act of abomination of desolation, as it pertains to the 70th week, the tribulation, that it's going to happen at the midpoint, it's going to be carried out to the end of the tribulation, but then it's all going to be consummated. God's going to wrap it all up, okay? Now, so let's talk about this. That's the text that Jesus is referring to in Matthew 24:15. When Jesus starts out and he says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by the prophet Daniel, this is what Jesus is referring to, all right? Now, so look in your outline. So here's the next thing we want to talk about. So remember, Daniel gave this prophecy in the 6th century BC, somewhere probably around 530, 540 BC, in that range, that neighborhood, okay? So we got to ask the question, what happened after Daniel gave that prophecy? Well, about 400 plus years or so after Daniel gave this prophecy, there was a partial fulfillment of the abomination of desolation that becomes a picture. It becomes a historical picture of what's going to come ultimately. Okay? Now, so here's what happened. So I went to one of my favorite sites when I need good, concise statements. Got Questions. Thank the Lord for Got Questions. All right? If you ever got a question, go to Got Questions, right? So here's what I find there. Here's how they condense it very well. Daniel's prophecies about the abomination of desolation seem to have at least a partial fulfillment in 167 BC, when a Greek ruler by the name of Antiochus IV, who named himself, can you remember what his name was? Antiochus Epiphanes. Okay? He was Antiochus IV, but he called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, which means illustrious one, or God manifest. So see, he's like thinking, oh, I'm God. I'm a God. Now you see how that's a picture of what's going to ultimately come? And this is history. Okay? This is history. And so he sets up an altar to Zeus and offers a pig on the altar of the temple in Jerusalem that existed at that time. You see how that's an abomination? He brings in this pagan idol. He offers a pig as a sacrifice on that altar. What's the problem with a pig being offered on the altar? It's unclean. That's totally unacceptable, forbidden by God. All right? And so he goes even further in that he commits all kinds of atrocities. He killed a bunch of Jews. He sold other Jews into slavery and so forth. And he forbade Jews to practice their covenant practice of circumcision and so forth. In fact, some called him not Antiochus Epiphanes, they called him Antiochus Epimanes, which means the madman. Okay, well, he was a bit... Antiochus? Antiochus. For those of you out there in cyber world, the question was, how do you spell his name? All right. Pam, I've got my reminder right here. All right. So you see, there's a partial fulfillment of this that happens 400 years after Daniel's prophecy. Okay. So, but it wasn't a complete, it's not the full fulfillment of that prophecy, because there was no kind of covenant made with the Jews or anything of that nature. But it becomes a historical picture or type. Now, notice the next thing in your outline is this. So following Jesus' prophecy about the abomination of desolation. So we got to ask this question. Okay, when Jesus made this statement, somewhere AD 30, about the date of his crucifixion and soon before his crucifixion and so forth. So when Jesus makes this prophecy of the abomination of desolation, what followed? Well, I go back to Got Questions, and here's how Got Questions summarizes this. The question then becomes, when after Jesus' day was the abomination of desolation prophecy fulfilled? Or are we still waiting for a fulfillment? And he goes on to talk about that for those of us who interpret Revelation as a future prophecy, that's a futurist point of view. Here's the position that we hold to, is this: that we see that the abomination of desolation is yet future, okay? The full fulfillment of it, okay? However, in AD 70, there was another sort of abomination that took place that involved the temple. Do you remember what it was? And before they destroyed the temple, the Roman general Titus comes in and he sets up pagan altars or idols and so forth in the temple and so forth. So here you got another historical picture of what is yet to come. But the ultimate fulfillment of it is still yet future, which is what we're looking at, all right? So then, I want you to look, if you would, because the future fulfillment deals with the first beast in Revelation 13, the Antichrist, right? Where in the end times, he's going to establish a covenant with Israel for 7 years, and he's going to exalt himself as God. Now, look in your outline, because the next reference is 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 through 4. Because Paul actually has something to say about this. So in chapter 2, verses 3 through 4, midway through verse number 3, Paul says this, that the man of sin, who does that title refer to? Antichrist. Okay? The man of sin, depending what translation you're reading, it might be the lawless one. Okay? But it says the man of sin will be revealed, the son of perdition, which means that Judas was just a picture of Antichrist. Now listen to this. The man of sin will be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped. Here's what I take away from that. Old Lucifer, who rebelled against God in heaven and who was envious and he wanted God's throne and he wanted to be worshipped, he hasn't changed his attitude one bit. Okay? Who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that, listen to this, he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Now, who's that talking about? The Antichrist. Okay? The beast. Now, so that alone, that is the ultimate fulfillment of the abomination of desolation, but it also stands to reason. Because remember what I told you earlier? As we make our way through the book of Revelation, here's what we're going to be seeing. You're going to hear the worship of the beast and the image of the beast being mentioned together. The implication being that they are worshiping the beast, the Antichrist, if he is present. When he's not present, they are worshiping the image of the beast. Now, What does the image of the beast bring into the equation? We've already got the Antichrist. He's the false Christ, all right? They're worshiping the Antichrist. But when you think of image, remember in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not make any graven image of me. What does that speak of? What does it forbid? Idolatry. So here's what I believe Paul's telling us. That what's going to happen is that when the Antichrist ends and breaks the covenant with Israel and stops the sacrifice, on that day, he's going to go into the temple. He's going to exalt himself as God and demand to be worshiped as God. And then when he leaves the temple and he's not, guess what's going to be put in his place? The image of the beast, an idol, just like Antiochus, just like Titus the Roman general. An idol is going to be brought into God's temple, and people are going to be demanded and forced with threat of death to worship that image. Therein is the abomination of desolation. And what Jesus is saying in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, and the verses that are following, he's saying hopefully there'll be some people in that day in Jerusalem and around that have a Bible and they can read and realize this is exactly what Jesus has talked about. It has happened. And the day of the great tribulation begins now. And as Jesus said in Matthew 24 that we read just a few moments ago, the great tribulation is going to be the absolute worst period of history in all the history of the world. There has never been a time like it. There will never be another time like it in the future. It's the worst time that will ever happen on earth. And as we've already been going through, and we've seen the seal judgments, and we've seen the trumpet judgments. Hey, listen, we haven't even gotten to the bowl judgments yet. Because just when you think it can't get any worse, the worst is yet to come. And we'll be getting into that here in just a few weeks. And so if you'll notice the last point in your outline, I kind of sum it up this way. The abomination that makes desolate, it'll be the abomination that makes desolate in two ways. Two ways you can say it. The Antichrist is going to make desolate or destroy any who refuse to worship him. He's going to seek to destroy anybody that does not pledge allegiance to him. And by the way, the term desolation can mean to ruin, be ruined, lay waste, to destroy. Okay? Secondly, it'll make desolate in this sense, that God will desolate or destroy in judgment all those who yield to the worship of the Antichrist and the beast and the false prophet and the image of the beast and his entire kingdom. And so in that sense, it is the fullness of the idea of the abomination of desolation. Okay? So I say all that for you to understand the background and the history of it, but to keep in mind that as we go forward, and when you begin reading those texts that talk about the worship of the beast and the image of the beast, now you know what's being referred to. Just because it doesn't use the terminology doesn't mean it's not referring to the same thing. That is the abomination of desolation. Okay? All right. Any questions? Thoughts? All right. Anybody? Comments, thoughts, complaints? All right. We will conclude. Sunday morning, we're going to be in chapter 14. And we'll be preaching a message on totally devoted. Remember, summed up the service Sunday morning by saying this. In light of everything that we've studied and what we've seen and what we know is ahead, and for the believers, those that come to faith in Christ during the tribulation, and the devotion that they demonstrate, why can't we should be encouraged to be more devoted, totally devoted. And just interesting to me that what follows in chapter 14 is a section that talks about and deals with that whole idea about being totally devoted. And so we'll get to that Sunday morning. All right, with that, we're going to conclude. Thank you all for joining us online. We're going to sign off. God bless and have a great evening. And I'm going to turn it over to Brother Don Harris.